Good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Baker. I'm the Director of the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization at Monash University. It's my pleasure to be introducing the lecture this evening. We've had a long-standing relationship with the Wheeler Centre. Whenever we have overseas visitors and we have to show them around Melbourne, I always tell them they have to visit Melbourne cafes and they have to come to the Wheeler Centre because it really is a gem in our city, and we're very fortunate that we have a centre like this of books and ideas. At Monash, we have a very prolific public program, and our speaker tonight is Professor Jeffrey Shandler, who is the head of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University in New Jersey. He's the author of numerous books. I don't want to be taking up your time by actually naming them all, but they're books that deal with American television and the Holocaust. He has written books on Yiddish culture and is here for a series called the Cronhill Lectures in Yiddish Culture. And this evening we're going to be hearing a lecture based on his book called Anne Frank Unbound, and the lecture topic is Anne Frank from Diary to Book. It's of interest to everyone here. It's of deep interest to me because next month I'm going to be in Amsterdam, and I've just read that a new production of Anne Frank has just been launched. The only problem is that it's in Dutch and I won't understand, so I've come here to listen to this lecture to see what I can learn more about this never-ending story of Anne Frank and the evolution of her story from diary to book. So it's with great pleasure that I invite Professor Shandler to speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and I want to thank you all for coming out this evening. In the 67 years since its initial publication in Dutch, this is the first edition of Anne Frank's diary, it has appeared in over 60 different languages and sold more than 31 million copies. That makes it one of the world's most widely read books. Moreover, the diary has been printed in hundreds of editions and in diverse formats, including abridged versions, anthologized excerpts, some published with Anne's other writings, teachers' or students' editions, limited editions for book collectors, for example, one published in France in 1959 with this frontispiece by Marc Chagall. And of course, there are also sound recordings. The published diary has appeared with different redactions of the original text and with various titles, cover designs, introductions, illustrations, and epilogues. And so each publication presents a distinct mediation of Anne's diary. And even as other mediations of the diary proliferate, plays such as the one that Mark mentioned, and there are films, artworks, musical compositions, monuments, educational programs, religious rituals, the act of reading the diary remains the foundational, if not always the initial encounter, and the one that seems closest to Anne's own practice of writing. The wide readership of Anne Frank's work has also fostered interest in the original diary's material form. Variously the object of veneration, suspicion, and scholarly scrutiny, Anne's first diary notebook, which is what we are looking at here, has become an icon. Its red and white plaid cover has been widely reproduced in books, on stage and screen, and more recently online. Similarly, photographs of Anne and of 263 Prinsengracht, the building where she hid, have become familiar symbols of Anne's life and are closely linked with her writing. Examining the diary as a material object, which will be my focus tonight, provides an unusual but nonetheless revealing perspective on the relationships between Anne Frank and her millions of readers, shaping their encounters with her life and work. The original manuscript of Anne's diary has been a subject of public attention as a physical object for decades. Pictures of the first notebook in which Anne began writing diary entries with this plaid cloth cover and metal lock have appeared in published editions of the diary since the early 1950s. The original diary has long been displayed in Amsterdam's Anne Frank House, and facsimiles have been exhibited in other venues, including in wax museums, depicting Anne in the act of writing. This is in Berlin. Covers of published editions of the diary sometimes reproduce the plaid covering of the original diary's first notebook. Here are two of a number of examples, thereby suggesting to readers that opening the book parallels opening Anne's actual diary. The plaid pattern of the notebook's cover is also reproduced on promotions for dramatizations of the official play, The Diary of Anne Frank, so it becomes in effect a form of branding for Anne Frank. While inherently bound to Anne's writing, the diary's iconic value as a material object has a history of its own, and this has both enhanced and complicated how people engage the diary. Consider, for example, the physical appearance of the diary in stage and film adaptations. The script of the 1955 official dramatization by Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett does not specify the appearance of Anne's diary. The stage directions simply describe it as a paper-bound or pasteboard-bound book. However, in the 1959 film version of The Diary of Anne Frank, which is based on the play, a careful reproduction of the original diary is used. This is a still from the film. It includes Anne's handwriting in Dutch and inserted photographs of the actual Anne Frank rather than pictures of Millie Perkins, the actress we see here, who plays Anne. The program for the premiere of the film was created in the shape of the original diary notebook, and when you opened it up, you could see, as they were giving you the credits of all the people who made the film, you can see the reproduction of the diary that they used in the making of the film. The film scholar Leshu Torchin notes that on one hand, the scene early in the film of the diary's presentation to Otto Frank when he returns to Amsterdam after the war makes use of this very authentic-looking prop. On the other hand, the action of the scene diverges from the actual history of when and how Miepries, who had rescued the diary after the Franks' arrest, gave Anne's father her manuscripts. In the film, this happens the minute he basically shows up having just come back from being liberated. In fact, she waited a long time until they were absolutely sure Anne was no longer alive before giving him her diary. Also, the film, like the stage play, portrays Anne writing entries in only one notebook, which is implicitly the equivalent of the single volume of the published diary familiar to readers. In fact, Anne's diary was written in several notebooks as well as on a sheaf of loose pages. Nevertheless, by the time Wendy Kesselman's authorized revision of the play The Diary of Anne Frank opened on Broadway in 1997, the diary's appearance was an established icon. The script's prop list specifies a diary in red and white checkered cloth. Here is a photo from a recent production of the revised version of the play. And so you can see a properly decorated book. Moreover, the diary's presence literally looms larger in this revised version of the play. At its conclusion, Otto Frank describes Anne's death. And then he picks up the diary from the floor saying, "This is all that remains." The stage directions explain that as he opens the notebook, the image of Anne's words fill the stage before the light fades to black. This device of projecting the text of the diary has been used in other performances based on Anne's life, including this recent staging in St. Paul, Minnesota of I Am Anne Frank, a music drama by Enid Futterman and Michael Cohen. Seeing Anne Frank's handwriting has also been invested with authenticating power. A reproduction of the diary's opening inscription in Anne's handwriting has been a staple of published editions since its first translations in the early 1950s. And here's that same inscription in the actual diary. This inscription gestures to the book's origins as a private document and, like the editions with a plaid cover, links reading the published diary with the intimacy of having a look at her actual manuscript. This sample of Anne's handwriting also betokens the diary's authenticity as a historical document, a fact that has entailed a continued need for defense. The published diary's enormous popularity has enhanced the text's evidentiary value far beyond the scope of chronicling Anne's wartime experiences. As a consequence, Holocaust deniers have regularly attacked the diary's authenticity since the late 1950s. According to historian Deborah Lipstadt, these attacks repeat the same unfounded claims, recycling old misinformation. In response, both the Anne Frank Funds, which is based in Basel, Switzerland, and the Dutch government undertook a series of analyses of the original diary to demonstrate that the writing is in fact from Anne's hand, and this is based on comparison with other known samples of her script, and the materials used were available in the Netherlands during the early 1940s. In the early 1980s, the State Forensic Science Laboratory of the Dutch Ministry of Justice subjected Anne's original notebooks and papers to extensive scrutiny, resulting in a 270-page report authenticating these as the works of Anne's hand, written with material available during the years 1942 to 1944. And this is just a sample from that report of the microanalysis and the careful measurement of the shape of the letters to authenticate the handwriting. In this report, defending the manuscript's validity entails a separate methodology from appreciating the literary merits or inspirational value of the text, and by extension, its author. Rather, Holocaust deniers' false allegations are refuted by scrutinizing the diary solely as a material object through the dispassionate science of forensics. Attention to Anne's original diary as a physical object extends to various facsimiles, which are at least as concerned with its materiality as with its contents, if not at times more so. Miniatures of the diary, both the original plaid notebook and published editions, have been made for doll houses, used in a puppet theater piece about Anne Frank. This was produced in Atlanta, Georgia, and can be found on a souvenir keychain that was sold in the bookstore of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. in the mid-1990s. The front of this keychain features Anne's name and portrait, and the back reproduces an inspirational citation from the diary. The keychain offers Anne's iconic name, face, and book, not merely as a novelty or souvenir of a museum visit, but as I would argue, as a kind of talisman, perhaps meant to be carried on journeys. I mean, it is a keychain after all, like St. Christopher's Medal, or to use a Jewish example, a copy of Tfilat HaDerech, the prayer for travelers. But not using a sacred image or text, but rather the materialization of Anne's life and work as a source of reassurance. Complementing these miniatures of Anne's diary is a giant replication. Oversized excerpts from the diary are reproduced in her handwriting on the facade of the Montessori school that Anne attended in Amsterdam in the 1930s. Here's a close-up over the entrance. You can see her handwriting a little better. Whereas the diary in miniature can invoke the heightened interiority and limited physical scope of Anne's experience in hiding, the gigantic diary transforms her writing into a monument. The scale endows Anne's words with the authoritative and didactic power of public art. Responding to increased scholarly attention to the original diary, Amsterdam's Anne Frank House, which holds the original manuscripts, commissioned 2 facsimiles of the various notebooks and loose pages in the late 1990s. And that way scholars who wanted to examine the original wouldn't have to handle the original, but could handle the facsimiles, and that would be better for wear and tear on the original diaries. Here are the facsimiles. 5 years in the making, they have a powerful symbolic significance beyond their instrumental value for scholarship and preservation. The Anne Frank House characterizes the facsimiles as fulfilling Anne's wish, which she expressed in her diary on April 5th, 1944, to go on living even after her death. And they explain, and I'm quoting from the Anne Frank House, these extraordinary facsimiles of Anne Frank's diary texts, which have now been brought to life, were created not only with professional expertise, but with love as well. The description of the painstaking process of the facsimile's fabrication is a remarkable document in itself, and it testifies to the extraordinary symbolic investment in this undertaking. For the facsimile of the first diary notebook, what we're looking at here, vintage postage stamps like those on items pasted into the diary were found, and then, and I'm quoting from the Anne Frank House's description, they were canceled in the same color ink with a postmark stamp fashioned just for this purpose. In order to recreate the red and white cloth covering of Anne's first diary, the project's weaver counted the threads of the original linen, found the right gauge thread, dyed the sample thread, determined the recurring pattern of the weave, and wove a few feet of matching material. The diary's lock, with its small moving part, is strangely tarnished, and it therefore took many attempts by the locksmith to copy the metal in terms of color and corrosion until an acceptable replica of the original was created. In this way, everything needed to produce a facsimile of this album, as well as all the elements Anne included in her diary, was copied with painstaking attention. This savoring of the effort to replicate the physical diaries marks it as a devotional act, undertaken, as the Anne Frank House said, it was undertaken with love. Moreover, characterizing the facsimiles as bringing the diary to life offers them as fulfilling Anne's desire and that of her readers for her to go on living after her death through her words. And these sentiments intimate that even though they were conceived as aids to scholarly research, these facsimiles are somehow magical. In fabricating the facsimiles, special pains were taken to reproduce the photographs of Anne in her diary. Anne pasted 19 photos of herself in the diary's first notebook, including its inside front cover, which I showed you earlier, and she wrote captions assessing her appearance in these images. Contemplating this photograph, she wondered whether she might make it to Hollywood. Some of these photographs are now widely familiar, in part thanks to their reproduction on the cover of the diary's published edition. So this photograph turns up on this, which was the first paperback edition published in the United States. As a consequence, these photos figure frequently in imaginary engagements with Anne, including in other works of literature. Several authors discuss contemplating Anne Frank's portrait in their own writing, including the Chilean poet Marjorie Agustín, who as a young girl received a small photograph of Anne from her grandmother. Agustín writes, "There was something in Anne's face, in her aspect, and in her age that reminded me of myself. I imagined her playing with my sisters and reading fragments of her diary to us." Caribbean author Carol Phillips explained in a 1998 essay that for the past 10 years or so, I have worked with a large poster of Anne Frank above my desk. In some strange way, she was partly responsible for my beginning to write, and as long as I continue to write, her presence is a comforting one. Phillips explained that he learned about the Holocaust as a boy in England, where he and his family had emigrated from his native St. Kitts, and this prompted him to write his first short story, which, like other fiction he has written, links autobiographical plots with stories of European anti-Semitism. Even as these photographs inform imagined engagements with Anne, responding to the intimacy of reading her diary, they pose a distinctive challenge. As they were all taken before Anne went into hiding, readers must imagine what changes took place in her appearance during those 2 years as she went through puberty and grew in size, issues discussed at length in the diary. In light of Anne's attention to her appearance in photographs, it's not surprising that the desire to imagine her is sometimes realized in photographic form. Especially striking is a digitally altered image that projects what Anne Frank would look like had she survived the Holocaust and lived to celebrate her 80th birthday in the year 2009. Here it is. The photograph was created for the Anne Frank Trust UK, which is based in London, to mark Anne's birthday and thereby promote awareness of the Holocaust. The Trust also used the image to encourage British students to consider what kinds of lives they want to lead by launching a competition for children to write a letter to their own 80-year-old selves in the future. The Michigan-based firm Fojo created this image of an 80-year-old Anne with forensic compositing techniques, which are usually employed to simulate age progression to help investigators solve crimes and find missing people. Besides conjuring Anne Frank as living into old age, the composite photographs also implicitly imagines solving the crime of her murder by undoing it, and thereby restoring the diary's missing author to her public. The diary's first published editions neither reference Anne's inclusion of photographs or drawings in her first notebook, nor do they reproduce them except when her portrait will appear on the cover or in a frontispiece. However, these books do include another graphic which does not appear in Anne's manuscripts. Beginning with the first edition of Het Achterhuis, many published versions of the diary include a ground plan of the 3 main floors of 263 Prinsengracht. This is from the first Dutch edition. This illustration shows each floor's layout and indicates the role of each room during the period that Anne and the others hid in the rear building's upper 2 stories. Rooms in the front of the building, used by Otto Frank's company, are labeled according to their function, the office, the storage room, and so on. Rooms in the annex show beds, cabinets, and other furnishings used by the Jews hidden there. The diagram calls special attention to the hinged bookcase linking the hiding place to the business offices. Some editions of the diary that do not include the ground plan present one or more photographs of the building, especially of the bookcase, in both closed and open positions. In most editions of the diary, the ground plan appears within the entry of July 9th, 1942, in which Anne describes at length the layout of the annex. Anne wrote this account not when the Franks first arrived there, but when she revised the diary almost 2 years later. Although the decision to include the ground plan published in the diary was made after Anne's death, it extends her impulse as author to provide readers with a detailed and comprehensive overview of the place in which the ensuing text is set. Reproducing a ground plan is unusual in a book that's not about architecture. But seldom has a text been so closely identified with a building as Anne's diary, beginning with its original title, Het Achterhuis, literally the house behind, usually translated into English as the annex or the secret annex. And this is a title that identifies the book not with its author or that it's a diary, but with its setting. Although the ground plan provides a useful reference tool for readers, its presence in the published diary is not simply instrumental. Rather, the ground plan reinforces the interrelation of text and place for readers by inviting them to envision, with architectural specificity, the rooms in which the ensuing 25 months of diary entries take place. Guided by this diagram, readers can imagine moving about the place where the diary was written and where the experiences it chronicles unfolded. It's not surprising then that by the mid-1950s, the diary's international success attracted visitors to 263 Prinsengracht. This is what the building looked like shortly after the war. Tours of the unused building were arranged by appointment. These were led at first by Johannes Kleiman, one of Otto Frank's employees who had helped hide the Jews in the annex. Earlier in the decade, the textile company Berghaus bought the block of houses that included 263, intending to raise the structures and build new offices. This plan was never realized, in part due to efforts to save what eventually came to be known as the Anne Frank House. In 1955, a Dutch newspaper decried the impending demolition of what it referred to as Anne Frank's Achterhuis and argued that it had become an unofficial monument, noting that for years now, the manuscript of Anne's diary is kept here and shown to visitors. The Anne Frank Stichting, which was established in 1953, played a strategic role in raising funds to renovate the building, which Berghaus eventually donated to the foundation for the purposes of creating a cultural center. The Anne Frank House and Museum, which is its official name, which includes both 263 Prinsengracht and the adjoining building, officially opened in 1960, and it soon became one of Amsterdam's most frequently visited tourist attractions. Visitors to the annex find themselves in a skeletal space, not unlike the ground plan reproduced in the book. The rooms are labeled according to their function during the period of the diary, but are largely empty of furniture or other items that would have been used by Anne and the others in hiding. This is the attic. That's all you see in the attic now, but then it would have been full of things that they were storing. The most compelling remnants of Anne's presence in the annex are photographs of movie stars and other pictures that she put up on the walls of her room, now behind protective glass, and the marks on the wall in Otto and Edith Frank's room, charting their daughter's growth while in hiding. For those who have read the diary, the power of visiting the Anne Frank house lies in the opportunity to enter the spaces outlined in the familiar two-dimensional ground plan, to inhabit briefly the actual space where so much activity known from Anne's writing took place, and to fill the empty rooms with details recalled from reading. The visit is therefore an encounter with both Anne's experience in hiding and the visitor's experience of reading. After passing through the admission area of the Anne Frank house, visitors proceed through 263 Prinsengracht, much as Anne did the day she and her family arrived to go into hiding, walking from the front ground level of the building up and back to the annex, moving from the public to the covert and from light into darkness. And of course, passing through where the bookcase is, which in fact wasn't there the day they arrived, but was added shortly thereafter. Then the Anne Frank house guides readers through a different narration of the events as recounted in the diary. For even though Anne's writing motivates visits to the building now bearing her name, the site imposes its own form onto the telling of her story by virtue of its architecture and the protocols of visiting a museum, especially one that is also a historical house, which ostensibly takes visitors back in time. Readers' progress through Anne's diary is defined by time, measured by dated entries, but visitors' movement through the Anne Frank house is defined by space, and it's articulated by proceeding from room to room according to a prescribed path. Museum goers then exit into the adjoining building to continue their visit. Readers of the diary, by contrast, enter the building with Anne on July 6th of 1942 and then circulate among its rooms, never leaving except by way of the book's epilogue, which recounts her arrest on August 4th of 1944. Although the configuration of tours of the Anne Frank house have changed over the years, especially after major renovations in the early 1970s and the mid-1990s, the visit has always framed a walk through the annex with displays of introductory material, with context about Anne and her family and the building and the Nazi era, followed by more displays after visiting the annex. These displays have offered additional information about the fate of the 8 Jews who hid in the building following their arrest, as well as the post-war lives of the people who had hid them. The centerpiece of the exhibitions that follow the tour of the house is Anne's original diary notebook, displayed by itself in a vitrine. In addition to information relating specifically to Jewish persecution under Nazism, the Anne Frank house has mounted exhibitions on human rights issues unrelated to the Holocaust. And this is in keeping with Otto Frank's wish that the institution should not be, in his words, a war museum or a shrine, but a place where the post-war generation could seek ways to work for peace. Past exhibitions have examined South Africa's policy of apartheid, the United States' war in Vietnam, right-wing extremism in Europe, among other topics. More recently, the Anne Frank House installed an interactive video presentation titled Free to Choose, The Limits of Freedom, which addresses a series of contemporary debates on human rights issues, such as the right of Sikh men to wear turbans while serving as policemen in Great Britain, or the challenges that the 2001 U.S. Patriot Act poses to American rights to privacy, or, as we see here, whether Hitler's Mein Kampf should be available for sale. The Anne Frank House explains that the connection between fundamental liberties and Anne's story is, in their words, simple. Nazi ideology sought to create a society where all freedoms were controlled. The system was used to plan the assassination of millions of human beings, including Anne. Fighting for the respect of fundamental liberties and for equality for all people are the major lessons of this era and constitute the basis for all democracies established after the war. So just as published editions of the diary include introductions and epilogues to frame Anne's entries with contextual information and moral exhortation, the Anne Frank House frames the time that visitors spend in the rooms that are central to the diary with background information on the Nazi era and displays inviting visitors to extend the moral inspiration provided by encountering Anne's hiding place to other contemporary human rights concerns. Configuring the museum visit in relation to the diary narrative has prompted different approaches over the years. The renovations of the mid-1990s expanded the restored areas to include the offices in the building's front half, reflecting the site's value for remembering not only the 8 Jews in hiding, but also the people who hid them and possibly who betrayed them. Also, before the renovation, the windows of the annex were uncovered, as you can see in this picture. As literary scholar James Young observed at the time, light would flood into the annex, whereas during the war, Anne's only exposure to the outside world was through a small square window in the attic, an image that I showed you earlier. Following this renovation, the windows of the annex were covered with black panels. So this room, now looks like this. Simulating the blackout cloths used where Anne wrote her diary there, these panels convey to visitors the cramped, isolated existence of the Jews in hiding. Another key difference between the building as described in the diary and as experienced by visitors is the bareness of the restored rooms in keeping with Otto Frank's wishes. A furnished scale model of the annex was created in 1961 for display inside the museum. In the 1990s, the Anne Frank House created a more elaborate model of the building as it appeared in the early 1940s in the form of a CD-ROM, which enables users to take a virtual tour of the building that is quite different from a visit to the actual site. For the purposes of the CD-ROM, the restored rooms of the building were dressed with period furniture and artifacts, recreating the environment as inhabited from 1942 to 1944 by the employees working in the building's front half and the Jews hiding in the annex. So here are two images from the CD-ROM of what these rooms looked like, fully furnished and dressed with props. Users of the CD-ROM can employ the computer's mouse to simulate moving through the rooms, exploring them with a panoptic gaze, and then can click on selected items for audio commentary accompanied by passages of Anne's diary. For example, in the Frank family bedroom, an open copy of Charles Dickens's Sketches by Boz lies on a bed next to an eyeglass case. The audio narrative, if you click on this, explains that Dickens was Otto Frank's favorite author and cites Anne's description in one of her diary entries of her father's reading. There are also sound effects, creaking stairs, a dripping faucet, and church bells, which enhance the illusion of walking about the building while its wartime inhabitants are nearby in other rooms. The CD-ROM links its virtual tour to a three-dimensional schematic model of the building, which enables users to skip from room to room at will. Subtitled A House with a Story, the CD-ROM uses the hyperlinking capabilities of digital technology to link the book and the building in a complex new configuration. It organizes the narrative not by following either the diary's chronology or the museum-goer's prescribed path, but rather according to users' idiosyncratic searches of individual rooms and their contents. Everything that users encounter in this virtual tour ultimately leads back to the diary. Spaces are labeled according to the people it mentions, objects cue particular diary entries. Yet even as this virtual tour centers on the diary, the CD-ROM tells a different story, not only of Anne Frank, but also of 263 Prinsengracht, providing a timeline of the building that begins before Anne and her family go into hiding and concluding with the establishment of the Anne Frank House and Museum. As a sign that the CD-ROM's narrative differs from the diary, the disc, at least when it was sold in the United States, came in a box along with a paperback copy of the diary. So you had this very high-tech encounter with a good old-fashioned book. Further complicating the diary's interrelation with the building, the renovated Anne Frank House now provides computer stations where museum-goers can take the CD-ROM's virtual tour after visiting the actual building. And before departing, they can purchase a copy of the diary, available in Dutch as well as several translations, in the museum's bookshop. This CD-ROM actually is no longer available. The technology, this technology moves very fast, but the entire program has been put on the Anne Frank House website, so you can see for yourself just how it works. It's quite remarkable. So to conclude, under the roof of 263 Prinsengracht, Anne's original diary manuscripts repose amid a complex of mediations. Readers, or potential readers, about half the people visiting the Anne Frank House have not read the diary yet. Readers or potential readers of published versions of the diary circulate among the building's empty rooms. As they do so, visitors traverse the layers of Anne's story, written and rewritten, translated and edited, published and materialized, inhabited and imagined. Even as these layers of mediation are often conflated or elided, they inform the millions of readers' encounters with Anne's life and work. Indeed, when readers discover these layers, it expands the story of Anne's life beyond her short years into another ongoing narrative about creating, sharing, and engaging with a single life story through a multitude of mediations. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much. I'm just wondering if Otto Frank is still alive or if he's passed away.
The question was whether Otto Frank is still alive. He passed away if I remember correctly, in around 1980. He was 90 or 91 years old, and that marked a real threshold in the dynamic of Anne Frank's remembrance, because he did play a very leading role in shaping how Anne should and should not be remembered. So he said, there will be one dramatization that is licensed, that's it. There will be no materializations, no T-shirts, no Anne Frank dolls, no notebooks that look like her diary. He was not going to have her merchandise. He was very concerned with maintaining a kind of control over how Anne should be remembered, how the diary should be encountered. At the same time, he was very keen on it being widely engaged as a paradigmatic work, not only about Anne, not only about the Holocaust, not only about his family, but really as an exemplary story for universal human rights concerns. And it was very much his vision that shaped the way people did and did not encounter the diary through the time that he was alive. Things started to change slowly after he passed away, including publishing new versions of the diary, including one called the Critical Edition, that shows how Anne had herself rewritten the diary, and then how her father redacted from the two incomplete versions of the diary that were recovered after the arrest, made the diary that was first published, which, when I read the diary and when pretty much everybody read the diary until the mid-1980s, we thought that was the diary. In fact, it was his redaction of his daughter's own rewriting, incomplete rewriting of the diary, and part of the original diary that she started keeping. And for the first time, you could see these layers, and this revealed a number of things. Most interestingly, what a gifted writer Anne was, especially what a gifted rewriter she was. And as I often say to my students, you really learn how to write when you rewrite, and she's the primary example. Because you see how 15-year-old Anne rewrites 13-year-old Anne, and the transformation is remarkable. And you see how her sense of writing literature developed. So his role is very important, and his passing also marks a changing era in the dynamics of Anne Frank remembrance. Other questions? I'll tell you about the other major milestones. In 2010, Méprise was the last person who knew Anne Frank. And while she was in hiding, she passed away at the age of 100. And she had been very visible as a public figure, speaking about Anne, and would speak to school groups. She wrote her own memoir, and she was a very visible figure. And that same year, one of the more unusual things that's also related in an oblique way to the diary happened, was that behind the building was a very large chestnut tree that was about 150 years old, and in the year 2010, it fell over during a storm. And didn't hurt anybody when it fell over, but the tree had in the meantime become a powerful symbol of Anne, so that in the years before that, people noticed that this tree was not in great shape, as it often happens with 150-year-old trees. And there were discussions about what should be done to keep it alive, or should it be taken down, because if it does fall over next to a building that has over 1 million visitors a year, somebody could get hurt. And this debate apparently everybody in Amsterdam had an opinion about this, and people beyond Amsterdam had an opinion about this. And then the tree fell down during a storm. So then what was the question? What do you do with the wood? And everybody and his uncle had an idea of what you should do with this tree. And when we were writing the book that Mark mentioned, we started collecting how people, came up with ideas. Some of them crazy, some of them very creative. And meanwhile, nothing has been done with it. It's in storage somewhere. But the ideas that this inspired is just remarkable. And we were thinking, why is this such a big deal? The tree is mentioned 3 times in the diary in passing. So its presence in the diary is oblique at best. Why was there such a fuss about this tree? And it occurred to us that the tree was the last living witness, if you extend your idea of living witness liberally, to Anne and the other people who were in hiding. And so its demise was another kind of death. It was another loss of a connection. And the connection, however, lives on, because before the tree collapsed, the people at the Anne Frank house started collecting the chestnuts that fell off of the tree. And they started sprouting saplings from the chestnut tree. And they are now planting Anne Frank trees at various places all over the world. So just before I came to Australia, this was about 3 weeks ago, I met the executive director of the Anne Frank House, who was he was in New York, but he was in New York en route to Washington, D.C., where they were going to plant one of these saplings, I think on the White House lawn, someplace special, very official. And this is now going on in key sites all around the world. And this is a remarkable phenomenon, and it's part of just the larger thing that drew my colleagues and me to this topic was, here's one book by one person that somehow becomes so widely popular, and people so widely take to heart. It's because it's a very intimate book. And because the author isn't around to shape our engagement with it. It's all in our imagination. That's what's so powerful about reading the book. That's what's so powerful about visiting the Anne Frank houses. The imagination is mobilized in a very powerful way. It spawns such a wide range of engagements. And at the center of it is this physical object that sits in the middle of the Anne Frank house, all by itself in a case, and it's tiny. And it's amazing to stand and watch people come close to it, because here is the source of all of this incredible engagement.
I just wondered if we knew, or if you knew, who else might have survived. We know that Anne's father survived. I wondered about the other.
He's the only of the 8 people to survive. In addition to Anne, her father, her mother, her older sister Margot, there is the Van Pelt's family, who in the diary become the Van Daan family. And the change of names is interesting. And then there is Fritz Pfeffer, the dentist, who becomes Mr. Dussel in the diary. Anne's father is the only one who survives. Among the people who hid them, who were working in the front office in this building, some of the men were arrested, but were later released. So they all survived, but Otto Frank's the only one to survive. The name changes, by the way. This has to do with Otto Frank's reworking the diary, is that Anne at a certain point decides to take her diary and turn it into a book that could be published. That's really going to be a kind of roman à clé. And that's because there's an appeal in the spring of 1944 from the Dutch government in exile. They say, look, we know there are people in hiding, we know there are people in resistance, we want you to document your lives so that we can know after the war how people in the Netherlands dealt with Nazi occupation. And Anne decides at the age of 15 that she's going to take her diary and make it a publishable document. And so she starts rewriting, and along the way she draws up a list of names because she doesn't want to use the real names of people. And so she came up with these changed of names for all the characters, including her own family. And her father used the changed names for everybody except the family. He felt that for the family, they get to keep their names. Anne wanted to change their last name to Robin instead of Frank. I don't know where she got that from, but that was going to be their last name. And but the other names, he used her pseudonyms, and so it's very emblematic of how her father was trying to honor his daughter's vision of the transformation of the diary, and at the same time he wanted it to be a memorial to her, so he had to keep her name on it. It's very remarkable to actually, you can see in the critical edition, you can see the list she draws up of this one will be called this, and this one will be called this, and this one. You can see her working it out, which is just quite remarkable.
I'm interested in the use of travelling exhibitions to continue the memory and promote the message. Particularly for those who can't visit Amsterdam, and also the literacy issue for those that don't read the book. How extensive has that been, and is there a lot of control in terms of where those exhibitions come from and who develops them?
Okay, so about traveling exhibitions, there's one in Sydney right now, and when I was in Sydney last week I got to see it, and it is an exhibition put together by the Anne Frank House that has traveled around the world. And they have done several such exhibitions changing the focus of what kind of issues they want to address. So I remember, I'm trying to remember how many years ago it was, maybe 10 years ago, there was an exhibition in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., which I think was done at least in partnership with the Anne Frank House, that focused on Anne the writer. And that's a very interesting shift away from focus on Anne as a historical figure to Anne as a creative figure. So these exhibitions, they do get around. As you know, not everybody gets to go to Amsterdam to visit the Anne Frank House or encounter her life and work in other ways. And the exhibitions are one way of telling the larger story of her life, of the experience of Jews under Nazi occupation, first in Germany, where her family comes from. That's where she was born, and then in Amsterdam and in the Netherlands, and also some focus on the legacy of Anne Frank. There are also Anne Frank centers in several cities, including in Frankfurt and in London, in New York, that do similar kind of work, and also because they're not traveling, they're permanent sites, they do educational programs, including the one in New York does very interesting programs about writing and tries to encourage people, saying, look, Anne was a writer, and writing helped her deal with the challenge of being a prisoner for 2 years. And so they've done a series of writing workshops, including one that they run for prisoners. They go into prisons and they talk to them about Anne Frank and the sort of the therapeutic value that writing had for them, and said, well, you can do that too. And that, I think, in a way, is in keeping with this impulse of Otto Frank's. It's like, what are the larger lessons that can be, brought out of his daughter's experience? And there's also a very different kind of engagement with her remembrance in Bergen-Belsen, which is where she eventually died, right before liberation. Both she and her sister died very shortly. We don't know the exact dates, but shortly before the camp was liberated. And it has a very interesting history as being a site, both official and unofficial, for her remembrance, what is named after her and when that happened. And very early on, in the mid-1950s, there was this sort of spontaneous movement among German youth who had read the diary and had seen the play. And it was organized through youth groups, and they decided, and they were in, I think, Hamburg, and they said, we were going to go to Bergen-Belsen, which is not exactly nearby, and we're going to put flowers on her grave. Of course, they show up at Bergen-Belsen, they discover that, people don't have individual graves, so they put flowers everywhere. And they started to do, and they did this every year for a number of years, and it was one of the first acts of public Holocaust remembrance to take place in West Germany. And her diary played a really key role there in Holocaust remembrance. So there are both stationary and mobile forms of Anne Frank remembrance that make for, and they overlap sometimes, that make for this very complex, ongoing act of remembering and drawing meaning out of her life and work.
Maybe I missed this, but how did Otto Frank, through all the turmoil and everything, manage to retrieve this little diary or these loose sheets of paper that...
Okay, so here's what happens is Anne's last diary entry is August 1st, 1944. On August 4th, she and the other Jews in hiding are arrested. They're taken away. They first go to Westerbork, which is a detention camp in the Netherlands, and then they go various ways until the end of their lives, or in the case of Otto Frank, until he was liberated from Auschwitz. The employees who had been hiding them, the men were arrested, the women were left alone. And Mipries writes about how she waited until the coast was clear, and she went in and just gathered up whatever was left, because when they came in to arrest them, and this was very typical, they weren't only looking for people, they were looking for valuables. So they just started emptying bags and cupboards and things, looking for money or jewelry or whatever. And in the course of this, Anne's diaries were just dumped on the floor. So Mipries gathers up all these papers, and she said, I don't even know what they were, but I gathered them up and put them in a drawer, and only looked at them after the war to see what they were, to give them to Otto Frank. And I realized I had Anne's diaries from reading through them, and I decided I'm not going to give them to him until we know whether Anne has lived or not, because it really, until you could confirm that people were alive or had died, it could take weeks or months. So she waited until they had confirmation that Anne had died, and then she turned them over to Otto Frank. And something she says in her memoirs was, she said, I put them in a drawer and I never looked at them, and it's a good thing that I didn't, because if I had, I would have had to destroy them. Because in the diary, it names people who were protecting Jews. And if those diaries were discovered, those people could have been arrested, those people could have been put to death. So she said, it's a good thing I never looked at it. So that's the story of how they're recovered. And when it was recovered, it was in two incomplete things. There was the rewritten diary that was never finished, and then there was the original diary, which is missing a notebook. Nobody knows what happened to it. And of course, while Anne was rewriting, she's continuing to write new entries. And Otto Frank had this mess of papers that he had to figure out what to do with. And at first he was just reading it and he said, I discovered a child I never knew existed. And then he decided, I'm going to take some excerpts and I'm going to type them up and showed them to Anne's grandmother, who was in Switzerland, who survived the war in Switzerland. He translated them to German because she didn't know Dutch. And then he took some other excerpts in German, in the Dutch original, and showed them to some close friends who said, this is really remarkable, and you should consider getting the diary published. And he apparently resisted for a while, but at a certain point decided he would do it. And had to figure out how of this material he had to redact it into something that would be readable. And it took a while to find a publisher. And it was the first edition by the press called Contact in Amsterdam. It was very small. And, but it managed to get attention enough because people started writing about it that in 1950, so it comes out in 47. In 1950, both a German and a French edition appear, and in 1952, an English language edition appears, and then it just takes off from there.
Did anyone else who was in hiding kept any notes? Among the papers that you picked up, was only the diary of
That's
Anne?
a good question. Apparently, people said that Margot kept a diary, her older sister kept a diary, but that was never found. I'm not 100% sure whether that is something people knew for sure, or it might have been something that she had done before the war but didn't continue doing in hiding. But much speculation, as you can imagine, has been engendered as to what her diary might be like. She was the older sister. She was the more mature, quieter sister. Anne is very spunky. I think that's part of the appeal of the diary. And she had a kind of self-assurance that people who knew her before she went into hiding were taken aback by, frankly. And they thought, you know, she's a piece of work. And I think that carries over into the power of the diary, is that there's just a lot of energy there. And you can only imagine this energy under confinement and under the constant watch of parents and an older sister. It's got to go somewhere. And it went into the diary.
Is it an urban myth that Otto Frank deleted some of the passages from the diary about the mother?
What he did is, when he redacted the diary, there are things he took out that Anne had in there, and there are things that Anne took out that he put back in. And he was particularly concerned, and he talked about this somewhere after the war, that he wanted to respect the memory of the dead. And Anne had some pretty hard things to say about her mother and about her parents' relationship that Otto Frank took out of the diary. When the critical edition was published, it wasn't included. And when it was discovered that there were these 5 pages of the diary that had not been in the critical edition, which was supposed to be complete, this was on the front page of the New York Times, mind you, they published the revised critical edition, which put this material in. And of course, that all happens after Otto Frank is no longer alive. I would say, you know, when you look at the decisions that he made, there's no consistency with, you know, and I think he was, you know, going from his gut as to what he wanted, what he thought should not be for public eyes, and what was okay. So Anne actually took out a fair amount of stuff about her on-again, off-again relationship with Peter, the young boy who's in hiding, and Otto Frank put it back in. Other things, so for example, Anne mentions when the dentists come, Mr. Dussel and the pseudonym, but Fritz Pfeffer, when he joined them in hiding, she mentions that he lives with a woman who's not Jewish, and they're not married, but that doesn't matter, you know. And she's like, whatever, you know. She's, you know, she may even think it's kind of cool, you know. Otto Frank takes that out. And I think out of a concern that, you know, is this going to be a source of embarrassment for his family? That would be my guess for why he did that. It puts in something else in its place. So there are, you know, it's seldom that he does that, but there are these times where, and it seems primarily motivated by respect for the dead, that certain things were taken out. But on the whole, Anne takes out more than he does. And in fact, at one point, as she's she's revising the diary, she's also writing new entries, and she writes at one point, I'm reading what I wrote a year and a half ago. I can't believe I wrote this. What was I thinking? And, it's part of what makes it so interesting is that it has these layers of rethinking of what should this diary look like.
On behalf of the Wheeler Centre, Monash University, and everyone here, I want to thank you for your talk. I'm sure everyone will agree that the endless fascination with all the permutations of the diary has been matched and mirrored by our own fascination with everything that you've provided us with this evening. So I'd like to thank you, Professor Shandler, for that wonderful talk.
Thank you.